Great. So should I start as soon as we go live?
In just a second, once I wave at you, because I want to hit record and make sure it is all going. All right. Boom, boom. I believe. Oh, Mark disappeared. I was going to say. Oh, Mark's recording. Good. I don't have to. Mark, well, I'll do it too, just in case. All right. Let me look on my phone just to make sure. Oh, it says we're live. Never mind. Oh, well, hi, whoever started texting me. All right, there we go. We are good.
Good. So we are good to go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first live event for TheoCon, Theology in a Time of Crisis. We're delighted to have you all with us this evening or this afternoon, as the case may be. My name is Sarah Lane Ritchie. I'm a lecturer in theology and science here at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And I'm here with my colleague and friend, Trip Fuller, a research fellow here with me in the School of Divinity. TheoCon is being sponsored by the University of Edinburgh, but our goal here is to make this project as collaborative and interdisciplinary and truly international as possible. So together, Trip and I are going to be hosting this series of live theology events throughout this month of June and also most of next month, July. And we're bringing together some of the world's leading cutting-edge theological voices on the theme of theology in a time of crisis. As you will be very well aware, the world is not short of crises at the moment. And most of us are living with an acutely heightened awareness of the need for incisive voices, offering insights and perhaps even suggesting new directions and possibilities as we navigate the months and the weeks and the days and the years ahead. So our goal in TheoCon is not to offer a generic, monolithic, standard theological view on crisis or any particular crisis, be it the COVID-19 pandemic, the racial injustice crisis that we're in the middle of, the climate crisis, or anything else entirely. Rather, we want to get as specific and diverse as possible, probing the depths of great theological minds in specific theological subdisciplines. So today we are kicking this series off with a look at theology and the arts, because it's our belief that this interdisciplinary area brings together a brilliant fusion of form and content, offering creative and even prophetic insights that can be difficult to articulate in more prosaic theological form. And so it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce our three guests for this evening. Hopefully you have already watched or listened to the excellent talks provided by Professor Christopher Southgate and Reverend John Bell. If you have not yet been able to watch or listen to these main talks, no worries, stick with us. Hopefully your interest will be piqued by the conversation and you can catch up later. So it just remains for me to introduce our guests. Professor Chris Southgate will be known to many of you as a leading voice in the science and religion world, and I'm delighted to call him a friend as well as a colleague. Chris is professor of Christian theodicy at the University of Exeter here in the UK. And you may know him particularly well for his book called The Groaning of Creation, God, Evolution, and the Problem of Evil, which has become a standard seminal work on the issue of suffering and creation. So very pertinent. He's also the editor of God, Humanity, and the Cosmos, a standard text in the science and religion field. And his most recent book is very aptly titled Theology in a Suffering World, Glory and Longing. In addition to the more academic work I've just described, though, Chris is also the author of 8 collections of poetry, the most recent being Rain Falling by the River, published in 2017, and Chasing the Raven, published in 2016. And I can attest from personal experience that Chris's poetry is just as brilliant as his more academic work, and I would urge all of you to check it out. Second, we have the Reverend John Bell, who is probably for many of you will not need any introduction. He is a very well-known hymn writer, composer, lecturer, and broadcaster, and is an ordained minister in the Church of Scotland, and also a leading member in the Iona community, which I think for many of you will be very well-known community. So he works throughout the world, leading lecturing in theological colleges in the UK, Canada, the United States. And he's primarily concerned with the renewal of congregational worship at the grassroots level. He has produced many collections of original hymns and songs, and 2 collections of songs of the World Church. And so if you are looking for more of his work, it's quite easy to find. So I would encourage you to check it out. And finally, as our respondent to these our wonderful talks that we have Dr. Rebecca Lamb. Rebecca is a lecturer in theology and the arts at the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews, also here in Scotland. She specializes in religion's influences on literature and visual culture from the 19th century to the present, with emphasis on Victorian aesthetics. She's currently completing a book on the theological and cultural implications of boredom, which sounds fascinating, perhaps particularly relevant at the moment when we're all in some form of lockdown. And she is a contributor to the open access Palgrave Encyclopedia on Victorian Women. She teaches in the School of Divinity's Institute of Theology, Imagination, and the Arts, which is a fantastic program I urge all of you to check out if you're interested in theology, imagination, and the arts at the graduate level. And she has run seminars on Christianity and culture in Rome, Oxford, and Toronto. So with that, I will turn things over to Trip to introduce the content of the talks for those of you who have not had a chance to engage with it yet or just need a reminder. And then we'll launch into Rebecca's response and some discussion.
All right. So I picked out 4 themes that came across their 2 talks that I hope if I lay them out very briefly, you will either remember what it was you were listening to when you were getting nerdy while doing dishes, or get lured over to listen to them on the podcast or watch video. And this is, it was a really fascinating connections between them because they didn't know what the other one was going to do. And then the themes popped up. So I'm really pumped to get to the conversation. The first was both of them talked about the power of lament. And a number of things that came out of when looking at the notion of the lament is that the gift of the poet's words is the ability to acknowledge things we can't find words for because poetry makes space it captures more than equations can capture. Also, lament is set in contrast in both their talks to the hallelujah. John says, are you really allowed to scream hallelujah with joy if you haven't also prayed, how long, O Lord? Both of them talk about the power of lament to both enlarge one's heart, but not enlarge one's heart as if it was seeking some type of perfection, but it's a type of enlargement that gives you space to acknowledge the grief, the longing, the pain, and the suffering that is before you. And lament, both acknowledge, is sometimes a gift in the tradition, but not always used in our liturgy. So one of the things to explore is what do we do in a time of crisis when we actually contain in different religious traditions the gift of poetic lament, but we have yet to figure out how to utilize them. Another one of the themes is the nature of solidarity, connection, and collective, and the challenge that we're facing at a time where we lack a shared vision, a shared narrative as a human species on the globe. And I'm not just talking about the type of religious diversity, but the framework in which we find meaning, purpose, and value. And so often religion is used to rebuild or re-narrate what was in the past and cling to it. And both of them use poetry here as a way to imagine a different type of solidarity, a different type of collective, a different type of connection, one in which, as they both point out, we have this old normal, and then we're moving. How do we move beyond it? Are we moving just to come back to what we can muster of the past, or is there a new type of being human together and being human even with more than just human life on this planet. And that led to them thinking around a series of theological questions that we can pick up. John talked about how theology often fails to utilize its resources and decides to fit this crisis in either the sin sniffers, which was one of the funniest things I've ever heard in a paper. The religious types that run around sniffing for the sin that we're going to use to scapegoat and blame for the cause of some crisis. And then you have others who are health and wealth style religious responses and insist that God is the protector, and then what the victim then is responsible for the crime. And those two options don't fit and don't work. And so they insist together that we have to rethink through our doctrine of creation. Good is not perfect. Creation being good is not perfect. We have to learn to live with limitations, risks, and uncertainty. We can't just collapse the ambiguity of creation into a vapid affirmation of God's goodness. And Christopher uses some beautiful poetry to get at that. And the last theme is the power of imagination, and in a sense, its gift for this moment. The gift of the poet, the gift of art, is the gift of imagination, being able to move beyond, or they both use this phrase of imagine living by visions, where and John uses that in connection with Martin Luther King, the way in which we are called through art into this performance of a new heaven and a new earth, to move beyond kind of walking into the future, looking back, but facing the future and seeking a new orientation as we live into new possibilities. And so, as I wrap this up, one of the things that really struck me is that that resonate between them is how they both see art as a means by which we can theologize when we don't have clarity of words to explain the situation. Because sometimes an explanation explains away the affect, the experience of it. And when the arts become means by which we can become human together and then figure out what it means to be in community together, they become real resources for living and for life. You're muted, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Trip. I was also struck by the two poles of the lived reality that we are now living in that were highlighted by our speakers. One being sort of the intrinsic nature of suffering as being a part of our world. Like suffering and what we would call tragedy are intrinsic in some way to creation, to the existence in which we find ourselves. And that calls for limit. At the same time, we are continually called to something else, right? We're continually being called to challenge existing structures, to constantly seek for the openings for change, for the constructive possibilities in the middle of the intrinsic suffering in which we find ourselves. So there's a tension almost there. There's a lived reality that feels very salient about this recognition of the need for lament and the intrinsic reality of suffering in our world, and at the same time the potential for new possibilities and the call to challenge that which is broken in the world. And this is sort of a space that is almost like uniquely suited to the arts. So with those reflections or summaries on our part, I think we are in good shape to turn things over to Dr. Rebecca Lamb, who has a response for our speakers tonight.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you, Sarah and Trip, for the invitation to be part of this initiative, which I think is very timely. And not only timely, but also something that reminds us what's timeless about the human condition as well, which is something that I think both John and Christopher spoke to very well. The way in which the arts is always already both timely and timeless, and that there have been many experiences throughout human history where people have endured and faced similar kinds of struggles, be it former plagues, the loss and devastation of World War I, and the list continues on. And something that I was so grateful for in listening to both Christopher's and John's beautiful lectures. They're beautiful. They're not only informative, but they're beautiful. And I think we need beautiful things right now. Is they really emphasize the fact that we can always at least live the examined life, and that the examined life is something that reminds us about what truly matters. And so even though this is a really difficult time for so many of us, truly a very difficult time, there is an opportunity within it, especially if we lean into aspects of it. And there's a way in which the arts, particularly poetry, for example, or the visual arts, which were emphasized, especially in both lectures, there's a way in which these modes of communication can even help us to start to talk about our own experience and even perhaps name some of it, because that's part of the difficulty of this time, even knowing what to call things or understand and define things as. So my response, first of all, will take the form of something of a reflection that will weave in aspects of what Christopher and John were bringing up. And then also I will end with a question, one question, though I have many, just because they were both such generative talks. So again, thank you very much for what you offered us. So during these very difficult times, we understandably turn to various forms of technology, in particular for redress, support, and hoped for resolutions. If we just look at the news headlines, very often everything is sort of centered around how close are we to getting a vaccination? What kinds of healthcare practices and forms of care and accompaniment can we offer during these incredibly difficult times, especially when we can't be close to each other or even really touch each other, right? Even if we look at social media platforms or the ways in which we rely so much on home deliveries, we really have technology to thank for so much. We would be suffering even more if we didn't have the different technological forms that are available to us. However, something that I've really noticed missing to a large degree, especially in the public sectors and on social media and so forth, or you have to go searching a bit harder for this, is discussion of the other things that we need to be sustained in this time. And particularly the arts are such a huge part of what can really support and connect us, as well as the value of the churches and other spiritual supports during these very difficult times. And something that I think Christopher and John really made a beautiful case for is how vital it is for us to not only look to, say, certain kinds of technological means for support, but also spiritual means of support. And by spiritual, I'm not only talking about, say, in particular, the Judeo-Christian support, which is something that both have talked about in their lectures, but also that the spiritual value of the arts in and of themselves, which reminds us about the more metaphysical or transcendent aspects of the human person that are shared within, across, and beyond history. And another thing that Christopher and John both point out to is that the arts can really help us not only to make meaning in this time, but also to face a very difficult fact, which we always want to run away from, regardless of what situation we're in. And this is our human fragility and really the reality of death itself, and the suffering that normally announces to us both of these things. And in the face of this fragility in particular, we find in the arts a very specific kind of resource or means of making meaning that even a vaccination can't offer us. As much as we need it, it can't offer that to us. We are used in so many ways to largely rely on what is the pragmatic, on the how-to, but we also need to think about the why, what for, the purpose and meaning within our daily lives. And so the arts are, in a sense, if I may say this, it sounds a bit crude, but a kind of soul technology, right? And as Seamus Heaney once put it, the arts help to extend our alphabet, offering us new ways to communicate what we think, experience, and feel. Along similar lines, Glenn Arbery tells us that the arts seek to tell us about ourselves, to provide us with a self-knowledge which we can all too easily forget, and perhaps we want to run away from. And also, because the arts are a mediated form of expression, it also gives us a little bit of that distance we need. Art is merciful in the sense that it allows us a little bit of mediation to slowly think through, to digest, to ruminate over the kinds of things it proposes to us. The arts can also offer us an opportunity to undergo what I like to call a kind of exodus from the ego, as it were. It can facilitate a turn towards others, towards God, in a way that can help us to see the richness of the paradox that underpins the example of Christ, or the Christic pattern, which can be a consolation for many in this times. Namely, this pattern of finding ourselves by first giving ourselves away, or even giving ourselves over to other things outside of ourselves that help us to then, in a sense, almost return to ourselves for a second finding. The arts also help us to find a way to articulate what we are feeling and enduring, and in so doing also put us into a wider conversation, which has been ongoing throughout centuries. Christopher, I am also a very great fan of T.S. Eliot, so I was so pleased with the beautiful way that you discussed him throughout your talk, and even turned to Eliot, who seems your good friend in so many ways, to name your talk, to find the right title for your talk. And what's so beautiful is that through the arts, we can have conversations, not just with the living, but also the dead, right? G.K. Chesterton has this great quote where he talks about the arts being, in a sense, a democratic place, because you can have conversations with the dead and give them their due, and give them as much attention as those who are living. So there's something, especially in these difficult, isolating times, that's enabled by the arts. And this is a certain kind of solidarity and sympathy, and it can be, again, with the living and the dead. And so we become inheritors of a very rich tradition, which hopefully can offer us consolation, or remind us that we're not in this alone, that we aren't the only people who have gone through difficult things. Now, that's not going to be a full, let's say, soul vaccination, right? It's not, but it will be a kind of a solace. Although we have to be careful for this not to turn into kind of a palliation only, right? I think John was very wise to emphasize that it's very easy to turn to the arts, or especially say the tradition of the Psalms, to look for a kind of palliation, or to find a way to think everything will be okay. Well, we really sometimes don't know if everything is going to be okay, which is even hard for me to say. And within the arts, and even within the Psalms and the rich tradition of lamentation that John so beautifully surveyed in his lecture, we see that sometimes acknowledging the reality of our suffering and leaning into it can actually help us to face it with at least more freedom, even if we can't face it with much more certainty. And it also reminds us that ultimately, especially because we are limited beings and fragile, that we are also religious beings, right? Who want to try to make meaning of things, even find some forms of certain rituals and prayer and a turning towards the transcendent to help get through this difficult time. And the arts can very often be means of perhaps inviting us to think about this, maybe even for the first time, or to actually seriously reconsider what we believe and hold to be valuable and truthful. Another thing that struck me about both John's and Christopher's talk is just the wide sweeping range that the arts offers to us for consideration. In both talks, we went from Africa to Britain, from Babylon to Minneapolis, right? And through that, we surveyed a great deal of pain, but also remarkable examples of resilience and hope in the face of extreme difficulties. But these examples of resilience and hope would seem shallow if they weren't so realistic and really delved into the reality of the difficulties that so many people have faced in the past and which they're facing now. Alongside this, I wanted to also note how struck I was by the way in which we can find resources in the language of other poets. Very often they say certain things that remind us that we also are struggling with the same issues or have the same longings and desires. And that poets can console other poets, or artists can even console and inspire other other artists. So there's a way in which art really always already facilitates community. It is not something that is made in a vacuum or in isolation. It requires you to turn towards other people, right? So it helps to facilitate, as I said earlier, that exodus from the ego. For example, I'm thinking about Christopher's lovely reflection on one of Malcolm Guite's sonnets that was specifically about Easter 2020. And that poem was so beautiful in and of itself, but then I grew to love it even more because it was clearly playing off of the poetic sensibility of my favorite poet, who is Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Victorian poet and Jesuit who has written some of, I think, the most exquisite nature poems, as well as poems about the dark night of the soul and the wrestle towards hope. That he explores in his art. And this is expressly the echo that happens in Guite's sonnet is when he talks about Christ being present in 10,000 places. And this is something which he is expressly picking up from Gerard Manley Hopkins' sonnet as Kingfishers Catch Fire, which is a beautiful poem about the nature of nature and also the nature of the human person, and how in the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, which professes that God became man, that God descended to earth, took on human experience and wanted to enter into human history and share in the burdens of human existence. Because Christ entered our human experience expressly, he, of course, is able to redeem all of it and give it a special meaning. And so at the conclusion of this sonnet, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, I invite all of you to read it and read it out loud. That's the best way to experience it. He closes with this beautiful profession, as it were, which seems to be an exclamation of joy, almost surprise, even though he believed it before he wrote it. One of Hopkins' ideas was that you come to understand something better through the creative arts. So say through writing poetry, that even if you've believed something before, you're all of a sudden tested by it, or it reveals itself as more true than you realized by working through it in, say, poetic form. And this is how he closes his sonnet. Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father, through the features of men's faces. Now, as Christopher has shown so beautifully in his talk, Guite is also drawing a similar conclusion. He presents it in more subdued tones, which is fitting for the subject that he's exploring, which is how Christ is present to people, especially those who are suffering during these very difficult times. And so we see in this communication between Guite and Hopkins, which spans over a century of difference almost, this beautiful kind of connection and relationship that can be shared with us. So something that I think is very important is the way in which friendship can be facilitated and encouraged by exploring the arts. Then also the arts can help us articulate our own concerns, and in so doing, draw us into a deeper, more empathetic conversation with past circumstances. And I think John has so beautifully communicated that in his lecture for us. He especially examined, and I've noted this a bit earlier, but I want to emphasize it a little bit because I think it's very important, even though something of a challenge for us, that the arts are not just to be a form of palliation for us or relief only. Rather, they're an invitation to enter into the depths. And in so doing, one is invited into, in a sense, into, again, the Christ movement within history. He descended down from heaven to enter into human experience. And of course, in his crucifixion, experienced the dregs, right, of suffering. The Psalms are not just to make us feel better, as John reminded us. They invite us to lean into our pain, a point which Augustine invites us to do in his Confessions when he talks about the only way to kind of work through your pain is to lean into it, to face it, to acknowledge it, and allow it to have its space. And that pain also is something that is required actually to strive towards authentic peace and justice, a point that John also explores in his lecture, which was very important. Peace is not just getting along in a certain tranquility. Rather, you get to peace by facing, as John put it, the rawness of feeling or the difficulties of lived experience. And peace is not just the cessation of struggle, but rather striving for the common good. This is something I'm also pulling from Augustine. So this doesn't even touch the surface or scratch the surface really of what Christopher and John offered us for reflection. But I would like to turn it back to them, just because I'm sure many will have questions to send to them. I have some things to ask them as well. And so for now, what I'd like to do is, well, first again, thank both of you for the lectures that you gave us, because there's so much there for our contemplation. And what a great way to start off this initiative, which I think is also so wonderful. It's very important that people see that what we care about as academics, theologians, and those in pastoral service is that none of this this matters because it is supposed to help us in our everyday lives. It's not just something to think about as a lecture, but it really has the opportunity to help us live more meaningful lives. With all that said, hopefully many of you realize that both Christopher and John are practicing artists in their own right. This has been mentioned by Sarah, but I just wanted to emphasize this again. And my first question to both of them actually is, how has the making of art influenced your understanding of the relationship between theology and art? So that's my first question for both of them.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'm not going to say anything much right now. I'll just turn this over to John and Chris. So you can both feel free to unmute yourselves and answer as you wish in response to what Rebecca's offered us. So thank you again, Rebecca.
If I can start, I'm going to tell an anecdote. It was the first time when I worked with people in a very deprived part of Glasgow. And a colleague and I were invited to meet with a small group to do leadership skills in this local church. We were asked if we would help people to lead an evening liturgy once every 6 weeks, and it was going to be, the first one was on healing. They had a service of prayers for healing. So my colleague, whose name was Mary, she and I decided we would centre this around the story of the hemorrhaging woman. And the first night we met these people, all of whom had left school at the age of 14. No one had ever spoken in public, and they were very apprehensive. We read the story of the hemorrhaging woman, and I said, well, when you heard that story, what did you think about it? Total silence. So I thought, well, we've all heard that before, but when we heard it read this time, was there something that jumped in? Total silence. And then the pastor, the minister, said, I think that this is probably the most concise of the synoptics. And all these people nodded their head. Now, they wouldn't know a synoptic if they found one in their bed. But because the definitive thing had been said by the theologian, they agreed. We had to discover how to get them to talk. And we remembered that in the ancient Celtic church, the artwork was very interesting, very stimulating. And so the next week we met, we had 200 black and white photographs, most of which had women in them. Mary read the story of the hemorrhaging woman, and we asked people to go and find her from these 200 photographs. All of them 20th century photographs, like people kissing, people working, people looking after children. They all come back with a different photograph, which they thought was the hemorrhaging woman. And then for around a quarter of an hour, in smaller groups, they argue with each other. And they begin to engage with the biblical text not because someone had given them an opinion which they could say yes or no to, but because they had been given an artifact which allowed for the exploration. And among other things, for me, I was very embarrassed because I'd always looked at this story from a kind of intellectual point of view. What had never, ever dawned on me was that the hemorrhaging woman could have been 23. I mean, I would have put her at 50. And one of these women said, well, if she had started menstruating when she was 11 and she'd been menstruating for 12 years, she could be 23. No, I never thought, ever had, in studying theology, had come across anything like that. And it struck me that when we have an artifact or a poem which we don't come to as if it were sacred text, but which we can begin to playfully engage with, then it can lead us into deeper truth than if we just speak face to face.
That's a lovely illustration of teaching at its best, it seems to me. And thank you. And thank you very much, Rebecca, for your observations, and particularly for your evocation of Hopkins. As Kingfishers Catch Fire is one of my kind of central texts. And it's interesting to me that just before the passage that you quoted, Hopkins says, the just man justices. So as characteristic is the flash of the kingfisher's wing and the sounding of a bell, is the justicing action of the just person, the way in which right living is worked out in a human life. And I think there is a link there to what I would, the particular interpretation that I put on those, the three things that the thunder says in the wasteland. The need for self-giving, for the emptying out of the ego, the need for receptivity to what's around us, not closing ourselves off from the signs of the times, and also so important in this current phase, the need to retain some control of the self, to retain a disciplined structure to what you called so helpfully the examined life. So I just wanted to note that connection and resonance before we go any further. There's loads more I could say, but perhaps I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you both of you very much for your response to Rebecca. We can move into a broader conversation at this point. I think is a good time for that. Before we get into questions from our audience members that have been sent in, I have a question for all three of you, actually, that you can feel free to answer as you would like. It's more of less of a question, more of like a tension point, I think, that many people have felt in these last few months. And it's something that Rebecca actually raised when she was talking about the recognition of our own mortality that often comes up for a lot of people, or has been coming up for a lot of people in this time of pandemic, particularly when we have had so many fewer distractions to which we can turn to sort of numb our own awareness of mortality, our own darkness at times. I was reading this fascinating article by somebody who suffered from extreme anxiety and depression. And he was writing about how he, contrary to what most people assumed he would be feeling under lockdown in a time of pandemic, contrary to what most people thought he would be feeling, which is in heightened anxiety and heightened sort of terror, he was actually feeling validated. He said for the first time in so long, he was feeling connected to humanity in a way that he almost never did, because everyone else was finally experiencing what he experienced on a day-to-day basis. And it was as if he felt that the rest of humanity had awakened to this, to the reality of mortality, to various forms of personal and inner darkness. that he dealt with all the time, and he actually felt that he was part of humanity and the community of his of fellow beings in a way that he very rarely had an opportunity to experience. And it got me thinking about this tension between the personal and the communal. And I'm thinking about this particularly in relationship to sort of the various sorts of crises that we're faced with at the moment, right? So in a very real sense, I think many of us have felt a sort of profound disconnection in the time of COVID-19 when we have not had human touch available to us. We haven't had the emotional and physical forms of real contact that are meaningful, that go beyond the computer screen. And we have felt that much of our human experience has been lost, and have had to face very personal and individual forms of crisis, even if we're not suffering from a physical illness ourselves. And then on the other hand, in the last few weeks, we've seen this remarkable outpouring of extreme emotion at a societal, communal level in the US and in the UK, around the world, around issues of racial injustice and police brutality and the issues surrounding that particular crisis. And it's almost it's been very social, very public, very communal. We've seen mass protests even, and so there's this interesting tension that we see where we find ourselves facing like very intense personal questions, but also very intense societal and communal questions that are raised by the crises in which we find ourselves. And we find ourselves turning to art in different forms, right? There are times, I'm sure for all of us, that we find ourselves unable to articulate exactly the form and the nature of our suffering, but the right song or the right image, the right poem is the only thing for it. You know, it's like we just can't be. There are no words for it, but there's a song for it, or there's an image for it. And at a societal level, perhaps we see that as well. So I'm wondering if maybe one or all of you could just say a little bit about how you see the role of the arts in the intersection of the personal and the communal in the various crises that we're finding ourselves.
I'll have a go at some of that. Very rich question, Sarah. I mean, I think there is a large level of disconnection, and perhaps a greater level than we quite realize, because I think we can, those of us who are on Zoom a lot and social media and so on, we can kid ourselves that we are connected to other people to a greater extent than we actually are. And but I mean, we are, of course, social primates, and we're used to being together as whole-bodied animals, responding to each other in all sorts of ways other than the electronic. So I think we are more disconnected perhaps than we sometimes realize. And I think that accounts for many people. It accounts for greater swings in mood and unpredictability of responses to others, because we don't have that regular rhythm of responding to others' cues that we're used to. But I think I think there's also something rather paradoxical to say, which is that I think in relation to church communities, many of them have felt some level of togetherness because they've had Zoom conversations and streamed worship and phone calls and so on. I think for many church people, what has been missing is that sense of transcendence you get by being a small person in a large church, or a small person in front of a large mountain, come to that. So that sense of God utterly beyond us, that great churches symbolize, I think is something that has been missing for people who are cooped up in their little house or flat. And to come back to your point, I think that's where music in particular, the transcendent qualities of the Bach oratorio, for instance, those are particularly important in helping to release that feeling of transcendence.
I've been interested in how particularly Radio 4 and BBC has been calling on the arts. You know, people putting in their kind of their favourite track list for Desert Island Disc, and people having poetry read, and this has happened in the news programmes. You know, before Radio 4's Today programme signed off at 9 o'clock, they were playing music for about 3 or 4 weeks, and talking to different people who should be playing or should be on stage and are unable to do that. And one of the great things which has just been alluded to is that the music evokes memory. And we all have inside ourselves, to some extent, a playlist from our past, which we can share with people of our own age group or our own cultural outlook, which allows us to kind of begin to talk about our feelings or what this reminds us of in a way which is different from just, you know, saying how you're feeling, I'm okay. But if you were to talk about what a particular song, whether it's a song from the 60s or the 70s when you're a teenager, which spoke to you then, how it speaks to you now, that's a very interesting thing. I'm interested in how, at the moment, I'm thinking of 2 or 3 instances in the past 3 or 4 days where, in one instance, it was a priest who wrote to me. The other one, it was a man who's got responsibility for a number of people and at work. And both of them talk of how they've become the objects of complaint in a way which hadn't happened before. Rational people, thoughtful people, suddenly turn on them. And I think that it's because that over 3 months, people have had to turn in on themselves and think a lot about their emotions and felt either panic or anger or regret or disappointment, and there's been no way in which to articulate it communally. And then your priest says something which is slight, you don't agree with it, and he or she takes the full welter of your discontent. And there's no way around this. I mean, I think that most people feel kind of fed up. We've been locked in for so long. It'd been nice to get out, to breathe fresh air, to be with other people. And if we were, although it's now seen as something you can't do, if we were singing together, or if we were all looking at the same film, or if we were all looking at the same Shakespearean tragedy, then we'd find common currency in which to deal with what is being, what's making us angry inside.
Just to follow up on a few other things related to what you were asking, Sarah. I was very intrigued by the article that you were mentioning, and I think part of the reason why perhaps this man was saying that he feels a certain solidarity with everyone because they are now perhaps experiencing more of what he experiences on a daily basis is, I think, because we live in COVID, because it's been so uncertain and it's been so hard. We're still figuring out how exactly this virus even works. There's just so much uncertainty, and of course, psychologists talk a lot about how anxiety is produced by not knowing who's looking at you. Right. And so we're really living in a society where we don't really know what's before us and how we're supposed to deal with that. and it's incredibly difficult. And then most of our ways of reaching out to others, particularly I'm thinking about those who live on their own, or perhaps are cut off from their family or friends or loved ones for various reasons. Some because they're heroically helping as doctors and nurses and so forth. Others because perhaps they've lost their loved ones, and the list goes on. What's really difficult is that we only really have online forms of connection right now in order to try to be with the people we love. And Marshall McLuhan, who was one of the most popular communication theorists of the 20th century, talked quite a bit about the ways in which different forms of technology can actually create a kind of discarnate experience. So you're having some kind of connection with a person, but it's not fleshly, as it were, right? You don't have the presence of the other before you. And I think that that's also something very difficult that people are experiencing. We're really made to be around and with and for each other. So there are ways in which our very forms of communication platforms right now are sort of subverting the very things that we want when we're using them, right? And psychologists have talked quite a bit about Zoom fatigue, for example. I am well acquainted with that with that, as I'm sure everyone is at this point, which is very difficult. So I think there are those sorts of things that have been mounting, and I have increasingly seen almost sort of reflected in the kind of rhetoric or language that's being used right now to talk about everything. There is the media is to an extent always already a bit at a heightened rhetorical pitch, but I'm noticing it even more right now. And I think that that's partly because some of the channels of mediation that we don't even realize are so essential for, right ordered and peaceful, even disagreement, don't seem available to us right now. They aren't available to us right now. And I think that that's a big part of what's going on. I also have been wondering, it's been so hard to see so much that's going on right now, even related to the protests and so forth, from such a distance, right? And I think we're all just so aware of being somewhat cut off from things, as it were, and really do that kind of distance from so much of what's going on right now, I think is also a very difficult burden that we're having to deal with. And especially this kind of distancing, this loss of a sense of presence, I think is also particularly felt for those who miss going to church for the reasons already mentioned, or also who are part of who live Christian practices where there's a strong emphasis on sacramentality. Many miss the sacraments, or being able to partake in the Eucharist, which can't be replaced by anything else. And so that also, I think, while very difficult, one of the ways I've been trying to cope with it, because I miss the Eucharist very much, is to think of solidarity with persecuted peoples who very often have not been able to go to church to receive the Eucharist for years, or have to do so in very limited ways. So I think that there have been a lot of benefits to all of this, and then just incredible difficulties, especially when it comes to psychological burdens. So that's what I'd like to offer.
Trip, did you want to take things in a direction?
Yeah, we got a number of questions people sent in advance, and then Sarah and I are grabbing them off all the different places it's streaming. So two different people asked a question about this. So in both of your keynotes, you talk about the biblical story of creation and the way it's traditionally understood, what's going on in the text and the possibilities that were there. Dr. Southgate said that if you think of the story in Genesis being forged in the wake of defeat, you start to see the cosmology that's being presented there differently. And they asked, one person said, that literally is the greatest theological tease of all time. What is this cosmology? And then someone else said they both picked up on creation as a thing a place to think through theologically. So maybe if you both want to talk about the way creation shows up in the Hebrew text.
Okay, so I'm very grateful here to my colleague Meg Warner, the Old Testament scholar, for her insights into the way in which some of these biblical texts assume their final form in response to traumatic situations, and particularly the exile to Babylon. And what I was suggesting was that that magnificent structured cosmology of Genesis 1, which sees the God of Israel as the God of everything that exists, and finds a place eventually for human beings within that very good creation. That's an exercise in making a larger framework around the suffering and predicament of the people, and that's what I was trying to convey in that little bit of the essay. There's lots more I could say about the ambiguity of creation, but perhaps I'll pass over to John, who said some interesting things about Genesis 2.
Well, I mean, the main thing which I was saying is that we're given a creation which God has declared good, but God didn't declare it perfect. And I think, when I've spoken about that before, people have been quite shocked. And there's nowhere in the Bible that it says that we're given a gift which is totally perfect. So there's something about having to come to terms with God not creating a world which is intentionally malign so that we get upset and we feel as if heaven has gone against us, or the weather's against us, or nature has taken it out on us. But rather, this is the only world there is for us. There is none other. And when we read this story and see that God, in the various days of creation, declares it good, it means to some extent that dealing with the raw stuff, that dealing with that which causes pain, is as important as dealing with sunset and rainbows and nice showers. And I think for me, the book of Job is a great book where he becomes all consumed with the suffering which he is enduring. And then right at the end, when God comes in the scene, you think God should say, Job, I'm so sorry. I should never let that devil give you a hard time. And instead, God says, stand up. I'm going to ask you some questions now. And then he opens the door to the wonder of creation, which is the thing that Job has been missing. And that puts in context the troubles which he has been experiencing.
So, go ahead, Sarah.
No, I think Chris had something there.
Well, I was just going to follow on for a moment from that, because what's striking in God's description of the world to Job is that it contains very many threatening creatures, and it contains the lions who need their prey, and the ravens who need to tear at dead flesh, and so on. And so to get beyond the sense that that creation is simply a place of beauty, and recognize that it does contain these deep ambiguities, and that viruses are indeed part of the world that God made, that seems to me a really important part of thinking through our situation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. We have a similar or a question that's also related to the concept of creation that's coming online. It's from Al. I'll just read it. It says, if we believe God to be incarnated, not only in a single person, but in the whole creation, then is not creation itself our temple? And can we experience transcendence in a connection with creation? perhaps this is a gift of the pandemic with the necessity of isolation? And so it's a fascinating question on its own, but I think it's particularly fascinating when we recognize the tensions within creation itself, how it is good but not perfect. So maybe any of the three of you could reflect a bit on sort of instead of always pining for the friends that we're not seeing or the connections that we're missing, what possibilities are opened up for us about our experience of creation itself in this time when perhaps more social connections are not available to us? What sorts of reflections maybe have you experienced on your own and during these last few months?
Well, I think that there is a missing link for most people, particularly who are urbanites. And that is the relationship that we have to the natural world. And I'm an urbanite, and for the first time since I was 18, I now have a small garden. And I'm quite mesmerized by the effect that this has had on me. It's not that I'm feeling unhappy, but suddenly you're engaged with a life force over which you don't really have any control. You can cut it down, but it grows of its own volition. I live in a neighbourhood. I live where my garden is the front of the house, and people in the last 3 days have come along because I have potatoes there, and they've flowered. And somebody thought that it was cannabis that I was growing because they never knew that potatoes had flowered. I remember that from childhood, but it's a new thing. And how do peas grow? And then watching bees flit from flower to flower. Now, I believe that God created nature and stands in a relationship with nature, which is almost a kind of person-to-person relationship. All through the Bible with this fancy language, particularly in the Psalms, about God speaking to creation, God asking creation to be witnesses against how God judges humanity, God commanding or expecting the rivers to clap their hands and the sea to roar and so on and so on. And it seems to me that the more we become hyper-polluted and the more we become urbanized and the more or the further away we get from creation, we do not engage with that song, with that movement, with that independent life force, which I believe is there for our healing. And I don't think it's this is not a new agey thing. It's as old as the Hebrew scriptures and older than that for our full humanity, it's insufficient for us just to deal with ourselves. Engagement with creation and its tragedies and its beauty opens our souls up to a bigger God than just the God of you and me.
Yes, I'd also say that I've found myself when I couldn't go to cafes in the way that poets love to do. I found myself instead doing what I used to do when I was a teenager and walking out in the late evening down to the river and spending time making friends again with the river and the great trees that surround it. And that's been really helpful in a particular way, because when the epidemic started, I really did think perhaps my life had only 2 weeks to run. I'm sure many people will have experienced that feeling and the anxiety that went with it. But spending time, of course, with the river and with those great trees that were born long before me and will long outlive me, it restores one's perspective on human life and allows us to see both the preciousness but also the intrinsic transience of it.
I'll just add one thing along that. I think this is a great opportunity to learn how to read the natural world. Actually, I'm an urbanite. I grew up in downtown Toronto, and now that I live here in St. Andrews, I've been immersed in nature and lived by the sea, and it's been quite an incredible experience for me. But so often I'll go for these wonderful long walks and realize I'm running into all these different plants and flowers, and I don't know what they're called. And so I've been taking a lot of photos and sharing them with a dear friend of mine who knows the names of every plant and things. And I've just been realizing how much of the world, even just around me in my little patch, I don't know very well. And so this has been a beautiful opportunity to expand one's vocabulary in a very particular way, and it's actually helped me, to relate better to a lot of the poetry that I do love very much, or someone like Gerard Manley Hopkins, who is such a nature poet, and he was very much inspired by the medieval sense that the world is this book that God has written, and it has many levels of interpretation, and that these the ways that we look at creation can help us learn not only more about it, but even draw examples from it for how to persevere, to live, and operate.
So one of the other questions that came in was connected to, we're really asked, can you spell out more about the ambiguity in the heart of creation and God's responsibility in light of something like coronavirus, as compared to kind of a more distinctively human problem like white supremacy and the violence? Like how does the doctrine of creation handle or differentiate between those two?
I think that might be my turn, just at least briefly anyway. Well, I think, I mean, this is a distinction which can be criticized and needs to be held with some nuance, but I think it is important to distinguish between the evils that arise out of human choices and the harms and sufferings that arise out of the way that that the world functions. Now, of course, bad human choices often exacerbate the suffering caused by nature, and we see that in many instances, and we see it again with the failure to relate appropriately to other animals, which leads us to acquire a virus from other creatures. But the potential for viral epidemics is always there, because the way that nature works is that creatures evolve which have the they have the goal of maximizing their potential, if you like. And so just as young leopards need to learn how to hunt and pull down prey, so also in a very different but analogous way, so microbes and viruses need to learn how to infect their hosts and multiply within them, and that, for whatever set of reasons, is the way that God has set up the world. Now, I believe that God has given human beings the opportunity to transcend their selfish natures and to live lives which are given over generously to love and justice. That's what distinguishes human being, if you like. But of course, that's a choice, and human history is full of the wrong choices.
I'll bring in, oh, sorry, go ahead, John, you go ahead, you respond.
I think that with regard to the natural world, we have to decide whether we live over against it or whether we live in companionship with it. And if you live over against it, then you see it as being an enemy. And there is a demonization sometimes, of the earth, of whether it's a virus or someone being killed by a snake bite or a wild animal, and we feel as if the world is against us. But part of, to my mind, maturity in faith is in realizing that we live in a world where there are risks, and that God loves the world so much that God comes in Jesus to take part in the risky business of living. And the life that Jesus leads is one where he could be contaminated by people who touch him or whom he touches. There are about 4 attempts on his life before the cross. He could have had food poisoning. There's nothing which is exempt from. But what he doesn't do is go through life complaining if suddenly the natural order turns against them, but rather sees that part of being a human being is to deal with tragedy, which might be of the natural order. But when you come to something like the atrocities that have been happening in the States and the Black Lives Matter movement, then you're not dealing with something which is inbuilt in creation. You're dealing with something which is the result of human selfishness or anger, and you might well give it the name of sin. And we have to separate these two. I mean, I love the story in John's Gospel about the man who's born blind, where both his disciples and the Pharisees want to know whether he sinned or whether his parents sinned. And Jesus says, nothing to do with you. It's nothing to do with sin. There's only one of his miracles where sin has to be forgiven. The rest have nothing to do with that at all. But then he points to how the Pharisees, who presume that this sin is of his undoing, are actually the people who are sinful themselves, because their presumptive knowledge has not taken into consideration that some people are born blind, and that's the way life is. And some people are born handicapped, and that's the way that life is. And the challenge for those of us who are able-bodied is how we live alongside and not see them as defective and be the ones who are supreme.
One of the other questions, and this one is definitely, evocative. All right. What makes art art? What makes liturgy liturgy? And what makes the world creation? That's what I'm talking about. You could tell someone was like, okay, I want to get them to all tell me their favorite thoughts. Let me come up with a very deep sounding question.
I'm happy to attempt to respond to some of this. A very good question. So liturgy, and again, there's sort of a general conception of liturgy, and then also depending on different faith traditions, even within the wide-ranging Christian denominations, there will be some difference. But liturgy is understood to come from liturgia, the work of prayer and worship. And it's understood slightly differently in different denominations, the work of the people in their prayer. And then also the work of God, Christ's salvific redemption of the world, his healing of the world that has sinned, that is fallen, that is out of joint. That is the primary meaning of liturgy. In certain Christian traditions, the understanding of liturgy is very much tied to the liturgy of the word, so meditation on the word of Christ and on the Gospels and the Old and the New Testament. So reflection on the liturgy of the word. So this idea that God has revealed aspects of himself to us through through language, right? Through oral tradition that was also then recorded in time through communities and centuries and things. Then there's also the liturgy of the Eucharist, which is a memorial of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. And that often is the primary understanding of the liturgy insofar as it's related to specific praxis or worship. Then there are also broader understandings of liturgy as well that have to do with, say, specific sorts of prayers and devotional practices as well. And it's very much ultimately concrete conversation with God through the different forms he's made available to us. So say the sacramental life, scripture, prayer, communal life. There's even the liturgy of the hours, which is very much a tradition within the Eastern and Western Christian churches that marks the hours or the passing of time through prayer. And indeed, the word hour comes from ora, the Latin for prayer, to pray. And I'm sure Christopher and John may want to add other things, so I'll leave that part at that. And then just to say something about art in particular, while in its basic point, it's a kind of making, a form of production, as it were. It's as it were, concrete manifestation of certain human faculties, like complex combination of our cognition, our imagination, our multimodal sensory abilities and so forth to make something, right? So there's a practical element to the arts, and Martin Heidegger contends that the wheel and the poem are both forms of art, of technology or art or techne. But then also the arts are also expressions of subjective experience within the world. And that's why they can be so important for looking at the way in which each person looks at the world, shares certain commonalities with others in our common human condition, but then also offers something unique and irreplaceable by virtue of being an individual person as well. So there's my attempt to answer your very good question.
I think this is such a wide-ranging question. We could talk about this until tomorrow morning. And so I'm just going to just throw a couple of things in which dawn on me. One is that art, excuse me, that art is not necessarily pragmatic, but the liturgy is. Because the purpose of liturgy is to enable people, usually corporately, interacting with each other, to offer a gift to God. And therefore, the focus of liturgy, ultimately, is the worship of our Creator. Art is something which is much more, I think, self-reflective of the author, of the artist, of the composer. And so we may end up feeling very impressed by what he or she has been able to do. Liturgy doesn't have that same possessiveness about it. It perhaps, for me, the best liturgy is that which is composed by and led by a group of people rather than by one gifted celebrant or gifted preacher. Yeah, I'll stop there because there's much more to say.
Well, I'm so glad that Rebecca and John fielded the harder 2/3 of that question. I'll just follow up by saying that what makes the world creation is the belief that it owes its existence entirely to God. And there are links there with what John was saying just now about relationship, because if the world belongs absolutely to God, then we cannot possess it, nor is it merely the object of our scientific study and technological use, but it is something to which we must relate because we too are creatures.
There's another question that came in online, follows on nicely from this. I'm going to read part of this from Jacob, who's curious about not just art in personal and communal experiential contexts, but also how do we think about how in our particular moment, we're witnessing a capitalist economic instrumentalization of education tilted towards business, law, tech, practical sciences. alongside massive international defunding of the arts and the humanities, cutting of funding for artists and arts and humanities programs, precisely in this moment when art and connection are most valuable, and helping people to hear people's help people to engage in creation and to center ethical reflection in societal and technological production. So the basic question here is, how do we approach supporting or advocating for societal support for the funding of arts and artists in this particular moment? And how might religious communities and voices advocate uniquely and materially for the arts? And I think the background of this is not only sort of like a hyper capitalization of education and societal kind of priorities, but also the current the enormous financial effects that the pandemic has taken on artistic communities. And of course, churches are not able to make art together at the moment, for the most part, at least not in the way that we traditionally think about it. And you see artists turning to crowdfunding essentially to try and support themselves at the moment. So do any of you have any thoughts about this time of crisis when we need the arts so very much, and yet they are without financial support in so many ways? What's to be done?
Well, I'm sure I don't know what's to be done, but I think that this has resonance with a key point that John makes towards the end of his essay about how the crisis reveals how distorted our world has become. And there seems to be a huge question simmering in the background as to whether the human race will do what it did after the last financial crisis and labor mightily to put back the existing system, or whether there will be exploration of new patterns of economics and new patterns of valuing.
Yeah, the arts help us to think outside the box. So much of our lives are dominated by rational thinking, the market, what we can purchase, and meaning does not necessarily come through scientific formulae, but comes from being able to reflect on the depth of life. And I think that for a society to be civilized, then you have to nurture that. You have to allow people to know that they are more than automatons in a cog. They're more than people who have to be fed. They're more than people who have to earn a wage. There are people who have to experience depth in life. And it fascinates me that whenever I engage with an Indigenous culture, last year was the Aboriginal people in Australia, or with the Scottish Aboriginal people in the Highlands, you discover that they are able to go through poverty and persecution and still, in the end of the day, to win through, because their life is not primarily organized along materialistic lines. And if we bend the knee to technology and bend the knee to the market all the time, then we're in a situation where we could be controlled by a despot very easily. And the arts are so important in allowing us to have the ability to self-reflect in a way in which, to some extent, technology, science, economics doesn't do it. It doesn't get into the depth.
I'll just briefly follow up to continue what both Christopher and John have been saying. Yes, well, the ultimate fix to it, I think, again, I couldn't predict all the different ways that we'd need to go. A few things to say. First and foremost, in our own personal lives, we can make the art's important for us, right? I do think that even just the habit of even reading, for example, or sharing books with friends and things like that can actually be a lovely start. Or having, I know I really appreciate growing up in a home where we were often read to and encouraged to experience the arts in various ways. I will also say, you know, as an academic who works in an interdisciplinary institute, the Institute of Theology, Imagination, and the Arts, I've been so grateful to be at a place at the University of St. Andrews where I can really explore the important intersections between art, theology, and everyday life. And I do think that a more holistic form of curriculum at all levels of education, and particularly within the university, a more liberal arts model that really looks at the holistic relationship between the disciplines and shows the ways in which theology can benefit scientific inquiry and vice versa and things like that, is incredibly important, because I do think a lot of students get to university level education and are taught to really just specialize right away and kind of be siloed into an area and become an expert in one particular area, and then be rather ignorant actually of a lot of other important subjects and disciplines that could help them to be even more creative and perhaps entrepreneurial. So certainly I think that universities need to hold on to and indeed further promote the humanities at this time in partnership with the other disciplines. So that's one thing I would offer, but I'd also say, you know, very grateful to all the artists who are persevering during this very difficult time. I think there's something very self-sacrificing about the artistic temperament anyway, but they do need support. So it'd be wonderful if that was given more of a focus. I do think we're a long way from that though. And I do think education is a way to help people realize in the future. I think we have to kind of take a long-term approach with something like this and think about things like curriculum, the enrichment of curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks so much, all of you. I'm aware that we are coming up at the end of our time today, and I'm wondering if you would each perhaps like to say a final few words about the topic this evening, and also let us know if there is a particular project or a work or an initiative that you are involved with at the moment that you'd like to share with our audience. And perhaps if there is a particular piece of art or a particular artistic source that you have been finding particularly meaningful or useful these last few months or in this current moment, do share that. Just, you know, what would you suggest for people? Where's a first stop? If you could have everybody go home tonight and engage with one piece of artistic creation, what would it be? And so do share as well, like how our viewers, our listeners can engage with your work further. If there's any particular work of your own that you would like them to plug into, go ahead and share that now.
Well, how long have we got? I suppose one final thing I wanted to say was that this is has been a very, very confusing time. And for the first few weeks of the lockdown, I certainly, I couldn't think a very coherent theological thought, and I certainly couldn't write a poem. And so I think it is a time to be very patient with ourselves, because all our systems and all our basic assumptions have been shattered by what has happened. But gradually, and I'm struck by how both theology and poetry have helped me to start to reassemble meaning within this crisis. I mentioned in my essay that I'd been reading the prison poems of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Those are extraordinary. But also the wonderful new translation of Rilke's Book of Hours by Burroughs and Macy is a very rich source of spiritual insight, I think.
Am I on? Yes. Well, I would encourage people, partly because I have reaped the benefit of just finding, even in the middle of the city, where life is growing, which you've got nothing to do with, and celebrating that. I do believe that nature is incredibly healing, and I do believe, because it's bigger than humanity, that we have to some extent, be its servants as well as its admirers. And I also think that we should not be shy at rediscovering the vocabulary of the Psalms. I think the Psalms are there to give us a vocabulary for lament and for complaint, which very often people are a bit afraid of. I think it's unworthy to say to God, I don't know where I am, why I'm in this situation, and even allowing the talk of enemies for the virus to be in the guise of that. I mean, I think it's a very interesting thing that because the virus is the enemy, do we ever see in these Psalms of lament and complaint and anger that we could envisage the virus as being the enemy, and then you're using a resource which Jesus endorsed, because as a Jew he would know the Psalms, as a rabbi probably off by heart. And earlier this year, I was at the book which I worked on with SPCK is called Living with the Psalms, and it's not a commentary on the Psalms, it's looking at the phenomena which I'd never really explored until I began to work on it, like why are the angry Psalms there and what do you do with Psalm 88? And if I were to look, I'm thinking that I'll probably go back to this now that I say it. One of the books which I've found very helpful all through my life is a book called Markings by Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the first Director General of United Nations, who mysteriously killed in a plane crash. It's never been solved. But a guy who had to struggle with the animosity of all the people of the United Nations who didn't agree with each other and to go through hard times. And he has a lovely poem, which I always find of incredible consolation. It begins tired, lonely, and it's like going up a hill, up a mountain and struggling. And then the last lines are, weep if you can, weep, but do not complain. The way chose you, and you must be thankful.
I just also like to reiterate that I think people need to be patient and gentle with themselves because it is a really hard time. A couple sources I would suggest are resources that are helpful. I particularly value the writing of Catherine Doherty, who is a 20th century mystic of sorts, but she wrote a lot about the value of everyday life and how the hidden years, a sort of Nazareth spirituality of when Christ, spent 30 out of 33 years of his life in obscurity, not really known, and how that was an important time in his ministry and his mission. So I think there's something about the hidden and quiet life right now that has been imposed upon us, whether we like it or not. That is also an invitation into a certain kind of silence and quiet. And so following up on that, two other things I suggest that might be of interest is the book, The Power of Silence by Cardinal Robert Sarah, who writes quite a bit about the role and value of silence in our own life from even a psychological perspective, but also theological and biblical one as well. But those might be a bit of, intensive depending on even how much time you have, because I know many of you are, probably even stealing or snatching some precious time just to be part of this, because many of you are working full time or dealing with being furloughed or perhaps even much harder circumstances and have children at home and things like that, or are struggling with the solitude. So sometimes also something I find very helpful is just taking a snatch of a poem or even a short passage of scripture and just sitting with it for a while, even if it's just for a few minutes, to see what it might give to you, as opposed to necessarily looking for something within it. So sometimes sitting quietly with the text for a bit can be really helpful, especially when things are hard. And if I may, one little shameless plug. I'm really impressed so many people have signed in for this, and just wanted to note that we have various resources at the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews for encouraging further study in relationship with theology, science, the arts, and so forth, and their connections with each other. So do check out our page, because we have a lot of exciting programs. One of them is distance learning as well. And so I did want to share that too. Thank you.
Awesome. Nothing seems to have broken while this happened. You all were brilliant and fun. So yeah, that's what when you have your first time doing something like this and you invite the artist on, it either is going to go splendid or something else. And we went with the splendid. The last thing I wanted to remind everyone is that coming up, that last question sounded like you wanted to ask John Cobb and Catherine Keller about it, who are the next live session when we discuss with process theologians. And I know John talks about the way the university has bifurcated disciplines and ostracized the humanities, because like what John was, Bell was saying, when you get rid of the humanities and the poetic resources, it's hard to cultivate imagination for a new normal in the way we relate to each other on the planet, economically, and all that kind of stuff. So that question, those conversations will continue on the 24th. And if you go to theocon.com, you can sign up to get the invite to all the live streams, follow on social media, get the downloads and everything. If you joined halfway through this, if you sign up, you'll get the email that will have the video and the audio in the podcast, so you can relive the excitement, especially if you happen to be sitting at home with small children who were banging on the door at random parts, and you thought to yourself, wow, they're all smiling like Rebecca just said something amazing, and I'm thinking they might make an appearance in the middle of the stream. So yeah. Any final thoughts, Sarah?
No, that's it. That's it for me. Thanks very much, everybody, for being here. And thanks again to our guests. We're delighted to have had you join us. Thank you so much for the diversity of your contributions, but also I'm always just amazed at how many through lines and connections there are between our diverse talks. So thank you to the three of you.